I'm Newt Gingrich. Please watch Journey to America, my new documentary on PBS about 9 remarkable individuals who strengthened our country through their pursuit of the American dream. From Albert Einstein to Hedy Lamarr to Zalmay Khalilzad, we explore how individual stories help shape our national identity. Watch Journey to America, premiering Tuesday, January 14th at 10 p.m. Eastern, 9 p.m. Central on PBS and the PBS app. On this episode of Newt's World, on December 8, 2024, the U.S. Treasury Department was notified by a third-party software provider, Beyond Trust, that a hacker had gained access to a security key, which allowed the intruder to override certain security protocols and access some Treasury Department office workstations and unclassified documents stored on them, according to the letter notifying the Senate Banking Committee of the breach. On Friday, January 3rd, the U.S. Treasury placed sanctions on Beijing-based cybersecurity company for its alleged role in multiple hacking incidents targeting critical U.S. infrastructure. Here to discuss the latest Chinese hacking incidents and what it means in the larger picture, I'm really pleased to welcome back my guest, Dr. Weifeng Zhang, Senior Advisor for the Office for Fiscal and Regulatory Analysis at the America First Policy Institute. He is a co-creator of the Policy Change Index, an open-source project that uses AI to analyze and predict government's actions based on their words. Weifeng, welcome, and listen, thank you so much for joining me once again on Newt's World.
Thank you very much for having me, Mr. Speaker.
Now, before we talk about the Treasury Department hack, I want to go back and start with Salt Typhoon. What is Salt Typhoon, and what have they been accused of doing?
So Salt Typhoon, which may or may not be directly related to the sanctions that was announced this time, was one of the many state-sponsored hacking attacks led by Chinese hackers and fundamentally sponsored and supported by the Chinese regime. And things like this actually have happened repeatedly and much more rampantly in recent years because the Chinese government has been much more aggressive than before in collecting intelligence from overseas, primarily from the American people and American government.
As I understand it, in late 2024, U.S. officials announced that hackers affiliated with Salt Typhoon had access to computer systems of 9 U.S. telecommunications companies, later acknowledged to include Verizon, AT&T, T-Mobile, Spectrum, Lumen, Consolidated Communications, and Windstream. I mean, virtually the entire American system. This has got to be over 90% of the system. And yet we say that Salt Typhoon accessed the computer systems of all of them. And if I understand it correctly, we believe they were able to access metadata of user calls, text messages, including date and timestamps, source and destination IP addresses, and phone numbers from over 1 million users, most of which were located in the Washington, D.C. metro area. Now, I'm an amateur about this, but that strikes me as a pretty amazing achievement. Can you walk us through what we know so far about the whole process of hack targeting, and in particular what happened at the U.S. Treasury Department?
Absolutely. So for that, I think we should go back to the beginning of the Internet in the early 2000s. Now we are talking about the former Chinese president Hu Jintao, before Xi Jinping even took office, was that the CCP had realized from the very beginning of the Internet age that information is really critical. They recognized the importance of controlling information flow, not only domestically within China, but also as much as possible elsewhere in the world. And that has a lot to do with what we call the open source intelligence model the CCP has prioritized, which means that they believe that compared to espionage, cultivating spies around the world, simply collecting information on the internet could be very useful. And so that has led to decades of efforts by the CCP to create the industry, the complex between the Chinese government agencies and a lot of tech firms in China to start collecting a lot of information around the world. And the primary target of that operation is the United States. Now, there are different ways to go about it, and China has exhausted all of them. There's the hardware side of things, meaning that, for example, in the telecom network that we have a lot of Chinese-made devices, and those devices primarily made by Huawei. Those devices have many vulnerabilities. And some of those vulnerabilities are actually hidden, meaning that there could be backdoor mechanisms that were left there when they were manufactured, and then the CCP may or may not try to access them until years later. And there's also software side of things, because hacking groups in China, they have gotten very good, and they work with overseas mercenaries, some based in Russia, some based in many other countries, and they took very complex routes eventually to get to information resided in the United States. So it's a very, very sophisticated operation.
In response to this most recent hack, the U.S. government imposed sanctions on a Beijing-based cybersecurity firm, Integrity Technology Group. Can you explain who this company is and what its connection to the Chinese Communist is?
I think the general public knows very little about individual tech companies, especially firms associated with cyber attacks in China, for a very good reason, which is that the CCP deliberately tried to make all these companies very secretive. And they oftentimes create different entities to conduct different operations. Even if any single entity is sanctioned by the US, they can create another one. They're just shells for the operations. And so it's very hard to actually find out. And it's very interesting you mentioned that, Mr. Speaker, that the US government is sanctioning one such entity this time. But there's so many of them. And the reason we are getting more and more rampant attacks from China, we have to think about it from our enemy's perspective, right? So what's the cost and benefits the hackers or the CCP will consider? If they initiate a hacking campaign against the US, if they succeed, they got a lot of information, right? If they fail, at least by how things are standing now, they lose one firm, particularly one shell, they can easily replace. We are really taking insufficient countermeasures to deal with this huge problem.
It seems to me that the idea of sanctions against individual companies, when in fact it's a collective effort sponsored by and supported by the Chinese government, it's almost silly. That's not a strategy. That's a public relations event.
That's like doing something as a gesture to say that at least, the administration is not sitting around, even though they are really pretty much sitting around there and doing nothing. It's a very difficult problem to actually tackle at the piecemeal manner. So meaning that if you find out one firm, you sanction them, and then tomorrow there will be a different firm, right? And so, which I think justifies a more systematic approach to deal with the Chinese hacking problems. For example, President Trump came out with a very strong position 8 years ago to ban Huawei, which is a great policy because once we ban the hardware, right, it solves a lot of problems. It doesn't solve all the problems, but it solves many problems. And so we have to sort of take broader measures. Another one I think is very important, we don't pay enough attention to, is that the US government itself is collecting a vast amount of information of the American people. We need to make the government smaller even in the information sense, because right now all the government agencies, they have a lot of information about the American people. Their information security is very low. And so once the Chinese hackers got a hang of even just one agency, it could potentially get a lot of information about the entire country. And I think that's not a very good position to be in.
So in a very real sense, you could almost argue that the Chinese are happy to have the American government gather up the information so they can then hack the American government and get all the stuff the American government's picked up at taxpayer expense.
Precisely. That's the wholesale approach, right? And that's actually very easy because if you look at holders of information on the US market, private companies, they are more secure because they have more resources to have a good defense. But government agencies, because of many reasons, they don't have very good security measures. But they are actually the biggest collector of information in the country. For example, just use taxation as an illustration. If you have a very simple tax system, then the American taxpayers would only need to submit very little information to the IRS, right? But when you have a very complex system, many deductions, many loopholes, then oftentimes people will have to submit information to justify those loopholes. That information is then with the IRS. So all the CCP would need to do is to hack the IRS.
In terms of the inability of the U.S. government to defend itself, 2015, the Office of Personnel Management had a data breach that exposed the personal information of over 20 million government employees and contractors. Think about that scale. We really don't understand the scale of and the intensity of the Chinese effort.
Absolutely. And a very important thing we need to focus on is how much our adversaries can make inferences by different pieces of information. The OPM hack, Mr. Speaker, you mentioned, it's actually a huge deal. Why? Because there are so many contractors in the Washington, D.C. area who worked with the government, right? And sometimes they don't disclose their work on the website for obvious security reasons. But if the OPM system is hacked, the CCP could find out which federal contractors are working for the federal government on which projects, because when the federal government is off, they're off too, right? So you can easily find out likely where exactly they're associated. And a lot of times these kind of piecemeal information, it's hard to make a lot of inference when you have a little bit of them. But if you have a lot of them, which the Chinese government does, the actual intelligence would scale up very quickly.
When you get data on 23 million people, most of whom aren't all that important and aren't involved in national security, what do the Chinese do with all that?
Well, there are two levels of intelligence. One is if you hack the Trump campaign, you learn a lot, right? That's obvious. But if you hack millions of people, it's helpful to think back at intelligence failure, episodes of intelligence failure in the past in the US. The CIA did not see, for example, the Iranian Revolution, right? And the reason they gave for that was, well, we didn't understand the groundswell of public opinions. And that's something you can learn about by having a vast amount of information on a vast amount of people. The same is true for Afghanistan too, right? So the US foolishly did not see that the Taliban can come back so fast, right? That's, again, a piece of information that requires a lot of pieces of information. So it's not really hacking a key individual, but it's hacking an entire nation or entire group of people.
With the rise of artificial intelligence, my guess is that they can now scan and analyze and look for parallels or connections on a scale we can't imagine. So 23 million files wouldn't be a big deal. You just let the computer keep grinding away at them.
Exactly. With today's computational power, that's a no-brainer. I think it comes down to really the combination of vast amount of data and then the advance in AI and computation. So that allows us to extract patterns, right? Because patterns is what would tell us about trends, and trends are more persistent. The rise of the Taliban, right? That's a trend that's way more persistent than hacking any single Taliban leaders, for example.
I'm Newt Gingrich. Please watch Journey to America, my new documentary on PBS about 9 remarkable individuals who strengthened our country through their pursuit of the American dream. From Albert Einstein to Hedy Lamarr to Zalmay Khalilzad, we explore how individual stories help shape our national identity. Watch Journey to America, premiering Tuesday, January 14th at 10 p.m. Eastern, 9 p.m. Central on PBS and the PBS app. So in a sense, in the cyber world, correct me if I've got this wrong, but there's sort of a gray zone where you have private sector hackers who may be Romanian or Russian or Chinese, all collaborating off and on for different reasons, and some of it's commercial. My sense is that the amount of money stolen or blackmailed is dramatically greater than we have any understanding of. And that, in fact, banks don't want to be open about it because they don't want people to understand how limited their ability is to protect information. You have an economic side, and then you have sort of a national security political side. And yet, with all this stuff, the Chinese Communist government's reaction is consistently, oh, we don't do that. It isn't us. Now, is it conceivable to you that you could have this scale of hacking coming from China without the totalitarian state knowing it?
I think we should take it as just a joke from the CCP. They say many things, right? We didn't do this, we didn't do that. But That might have some truth at the beginning of the economic reforms. For example, in the 90s, perhaps when China was trying to be more open, and there was some space between the state sector and the private sector. But in the last 20 years, that no longer is the case. Even private companies, think about Huawei, right? Huawei is a perfectly private company. It's not perfect, but it's perfectly private company. But it's under full control by the state. So it's laughable to think that all these activities are happening without the CCP supporting, even proactively.
Christopher Wray, the FBI director, said at a security conference in Germany, quote, "The cyber threat posed by the Chinese government is massive. China's hacking program is larger than that of every other major nation combined." How should we respond to that?
I think we should go back to the cost and benefit to think in our adversaries' perspective, to put us in their shoes. Because when they contemplate about hacking the United States, the benefit now is much larger than it used to be before. Because every additional piece of information they can gather from the US, that could be put together with the information they had already gotten in the past and make a lot more inferences, right? So that's the networked effect of different pieces of information. When you have more pieces of a puzzle, you see the picture very clearly. When you only have a few pieces, it doesn't really mean much, right? So the marginal return of hacking for the Chinese is increasing. But the cost of hacking is decreasing, especially under the Biden administration. Sometimes they would sanction one or two Chinese firms. That's a huge problem. Now, we can talk about what kind of countermeasures are the best. We might hack back, we might impose punitive sanctions across the board on Chinese goods or Chinese investments, for example. We could think more about how to liberate the private sector in coming up with better defense for the information in the United States. But what we cannot do is to just sanction one or two firms, because we need to increase the punishment the Chinese hackers would face, because their reward is increasing every single day.
For a very, very long time, we were the dominant player with the National Security Agency, and we had capabilities of accessing and understanding information that was dramatically greater than anybody else. How do you distinguish the efforts that we've made over the years to maximize our intelligence capabilities with the kind of things that the Chinese are doing?
I think the main difference is that sometimes U.S. actors, they do have the capabilities, but sometimes they are misdirected. When we think about law enforcement in the United States, oftentimes in recent years, they are more and more politicized, right? So you have all these ammunitions that are not really pointed at the enemies, but our own people, and that's not right. And the other thing is that for the CCP, it's not a problem. They just enhance capabilities to spy on anybody, including their own people, which is a given already, right? So they spy on the Chinese people, but then they increasingly have their eyes overseas. They have their eyes on targets like the United States and Europe, the UK. Europe and UK no longer quite matter that much to the CCP, but the US matters even more.
Somebody pointed out to me that a lot of places around the world are buying Chinese equipment, for example, for facial recognition. And that somebody who might be a covert agent in one country could be picked up traveling in another country by the cameras.
Absolutely, absolutely.
And then they could analyze it and figure out who that person is. And so they're really acquiring a worldwide ability to gather information and spy on people on a scale that's totally outside the nation state. I mean, it's genuinely global. Does that fit with what you're seeing?
Absolutely. And I think the Chinese always had that plan. Long ago, it's the same plan. They're just carrying through over the years. Mr. Speaker, you talked about the facial recognition from footage, right? Let's say you penetrate one country in whatever footage they have, right? That doesn't really mean a lot. But when you penetrate enough, then you can figure out other agents, right? So it really needs the scale of the operation.
Let me ask you about a couple things beyond cyber. How did you interpret the school bus size spy balloon in 2023?
I think that what was most striking to me was the incapabilities of our administration to respond. It took forever to shut them down in the first place, but they also came out initially to say the balloons were not collecting information in the US. And then they later admitted, okay, sorry, they are collecting information in the United States. This is just incapabilities. I think we should not shy away from recognizing that a lot of responsibilities is on our end. But the Chinese, they always try to do that, right? And then the weather balloons, and then they try to use it for other information collection purposes. I have to say that's the same for any Chinese equipment, right? Chinese hardware. They would sell smart devices around the world, and then they would record those conversations by the customers, and then they would send them back to China. It's the same thing.
Are you at all concerned about the degree to which the Chinese are buying up U.S. farmland, particularly near military bases?
I am very concerned about this. I'm not against, for example, Chinese nationals purchasing property, like a very broad rule in the United States, right? We have a lot of Chinese immigrants buying houses in the United States. That does not necessarily become a national security issue. But when you buy farmlands near military bases, that would be a huge problem. In the past, some people think of that as like fear, just have an anti-Chinese sentiment or anti-Asian sentiment. Let's look at the track records of the CCP, like what kind of information have they been collecting? And it is true that they exhaust all sorts of means possible to spy on American people. So I think it's much more well-justified fear than it was before.
One other topic that is sort of unavoidable when you're talking about the internet in China, and that's TikTok. Do you think that an American could buy TikTok, liberate it from Chinese control, and actually keep it going without the Chinese having such dense penetration of the system that it's inevitably enabling them to, in various ways, distort what's going on?
That's a really tricky issue. So there are two levels, I think, to look at this. One is, should TikTok exist in its current form in the United States? And the second is whether it's even possible to ban it, right, or change its form. I'm less certain about the second one, but I'm very certain about the first one, meaning that TikTok in its current form should not exist in the United States because of the level of information collection on the app. There are many, many studies about this, and the way that they penetrate information, not only just on users' behavior, scoring the app on the phone, but also other information the users has on their phone could potentially come through the app and be obtained by the CCP. Even passwords you use on your bank could potentially be sent over to the CCP. So that's a huge problem. Now, how is it even possible to ban TikTok? I think that's harder to address because there's First Amendment issues there. I think the best outcome might be to force a sale to an American entity such that we can have better protection without having to eliminate the app in the US market.
So let's say you did sell TikTok. Would that mean that the hardware would have to be inside the United States? And isn't part of the problem right now that the ultimate center of information flow is in China?
Exactly. I think it all comes down to hardware.
So you'd somehow have to literally transfer the American TikTok. And does that then mean you're transferring the worldwide TikTok? Or would the non-American part still be Chinese?
As it is now, TikTok claimed that they have undergone a measure to enhance data security. That's what they claim. And what that meant is there is, I think, a US entity, hardware, that it ultimately store the information. But ironically, the information first comes through China and goes to the US hardware and then stay there. That doesn't really help a lot or a single bit because the CCP has them all. It's really a joke to say that that's a security measure. So eventually, I think the real secure way would require information to not flow through mainland China at all, and then to prevent any Chinese entity from ever accessing the US portion of the information. Now, the CCP might want to have access to the Chinese version of TikTok, and to the extent that overseas TikTok and their Chinese allies, and that's a problem beyond the United States. But at least we should make sure that the US portion of it is secure.
As you know, a study published last Thursday asserts TikTok's algorithms promote Chinese Communist Party narratives and suppress content critical of those narratives, a claim that TikTok forcefully denies. Entitled The CCP's Digital Charm Offensive, the study by the Rutgers University-based Network Contagion Research Institute argues that much of the pro-China content originates from state-linked entities. ByteDance, a Chinese technology company, owns TikTok. What should we be doing about that?
There's certainly validity to the findings. I see that as just a small function of TikTok, meaning that, yes, it's a popular app, right? It has a wide reach in the American audience. And so any censorship or propaganda on this network is going to affect a lot of American people. But I think that's an obvious trivial way. The Trump reference in this example is that they're trying to put out content that would put the CCP in a more positive light and put US politics in a negative light. The CCP always does anyway with any other outlets they have. But a harder problem is actually that because TikTok app is so addictive, it's addicted to many people so that they keep scrolling on the app for more and more videos, right? And the process of that is actually the reason TikTok is so popular. The algorithm actually tries to learn your preferences. They learn what you like and not like, and they try to recommend more content for you to keep looking. And the fact that they're so successful means that they have already figured out the preferences of the American people, which means that they understand, again, going back to the groundswell issue here, right? So they understanding the US population at a deeper and deeper level every single day. And that would help them make a lot of valuable judgment about where this country is going, what people might do in various different occasions, including in elections. And that's very concerning.
So in a sense, where we rely on, say, national polling of 2,000 or 3,000 sample, they actually have tens of millions of pieces of data that give them dramatically richer and deeper insights into who we are.
And that's oftentimes the future generation of the American people.
Given everything we've talked about, if the United States wanted to undertake a grand strategy to raise the cost to the Chinese Communist government to such a point that they would actually cut off this behavior and police against it, what would that kind of a strategy look like?
Well, that's hard to contemplate, right? And the problem is that once you contemplate it, it might lose some of the effect. Because in the end, at some point, it becomes the same thing as talking about military deterrence. Chinese has a lot of military power too, and it's not using against the US yet, right? And so we want China's cyber attack to be like its military power, to not be used upon the US and its allies. But right now it is being used by US and its allies. It comes down to deterrence, and there are so many ways of deterrence. I think it may not necessarily mean cyber deterrence. You could deter Chinese in other ways, right? So for example, threatening certain severing of economic relations with the Chinese in some areas, like punitive tariffs might be a way. I'm sure the incoming president has a lot of ideas too. I think thinking too openly about this may not even be a good idea, but I don't know. But if you ask me, I would think that keeping the enemies guessing and outlining some maximum response, we might go there, we don't necessarily go there, but we might go there someday. Having this kind of range of actions to be known by our adversaries will be the best.
This may be a minor thing, but we ought to seriously consider reestablishing sort of a radio-free China and the kind of traditional propaganda we used against the Soviet Union and the various satellite states. Because somehow we have to communicate that hostility can't be one-sided, that we can't be permanently on defense and they get to come and play. We have to communicate that if they actually want to engage in a genuine Cold War, and in a sense this cyber offensive is part of a Cold War, then we have tools we can use too, and they're in fact much more vulnerable to domestic discontent, and I think probably more frightened of it than we have any current notion. And I think back to the Taiping rebellion, which cost about 75 million lives in the 1860s and 70s. And this is why Tiananmen Square was so violent. They have a very clear sense that their population can get out of control much faster, much more decisively than any free society. That may be the wrong idea or the wrong approach, but it does seem to me we can't continue to pretend that we are totally at peace. Doesn't mean we have to go to war militarily, but we have to recognize we have a genuine adversary, and every morning they have lots of people trying to figure out how to cause us harm. And the harm may be electronic, it may not be military, but it's still harm.
Absolutely, and we often think about, rightfully so, that the Chinese regime is our adversary, right? But the Chinese people are not, right? And you referenced the Tiananmen Square protest and the violent crackdown. But even if you look at the protest across in many cities in China, right before China lifted the COVID restriction, the zero COVID restrictions a few years ago, right? That basically came right after the wave of protests happening in mainland China. It means that the Chinese people actually, they know, at least those more educated fraction of the Chinese people who are able to get over the internet censorship, they know what's going on in the world, and they see America as a better example of how to govern, right? And so the implication of that is, first, we need to change the direction our country is currently going. We need to correct all these wrongs that have happened, particularly in the last 4 years, right? We need to move to the right direction because it sets an example even for audiences in China. And the other lesson, I think, is those people who know in China, they're not getting the information from Radio Free China, not necessarily, not exclusively. They're not getting it from Voice of America Mandarin channel necessarily, because once they have the capabilities to jump the great internet firewall, they can see everything in the world, right? I'm not so much convinced about having to penetrate information flow into China, because websites like the VOA China would be banned anyway by the CCP, right? It really comes down to some people in China, they can come outside, and once they come outside, they see everything, right? They can see the New York Times, they can see the Wall Street Journal. I think what we need to do the most is to set a great example to the Chinese people in the sense of being a good influence, right? What a democracy should be and what an open society should be. And then hopefully more and more of them will be increasingly gravitating toward it.
Is there a role for us or a place to try to help communicate how you can break through the various barriers, or do they just naturally evolve on their own internally?
Well, so far it has been evolving internally. There are what's called VPN, Virtual Private Network Services in China, that helps people to get over the firewall. The CCP keeps cracking down on those tools, so people will have to keep looking for new tools every other month. Some pro-democracy movement could take the form of providing the Chinese people better access to internet.
That's a fascinating point. It's our generation's version of putting out small radios in the 1950s and 60s to try to penetrate the barriers. It's utterly fascinating. Wei Feng, look, I want to thank you for joining me and for helping us better understand the context of China's recent cyber espionage efforts. Our listeners can follow your work by visiting the America First Policy Institute's website at americafirstpolicy.com. And I really appreciate you being our guest again, and I'm confident as the world evolves, we're going to come back to you for wisdom again in the future. But thank you very much for sharing with us today.
Thank you very much for having me again, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you to my guest, Wei Feng Zhang. You can learn more about the China's cyber espionage efforts on our show page at newsworld.com. Newsworld is produced by Gingrich 360 and iHeartMedia. Our executive producer is Garnsey Sloan. Our researcher is Rachel Peterson. The artwork for the show was created by Steve Penley. Special thanks to the team at Gingrich 360. If you've been enjoying Newsworld, I hope you'll go to Apple Podcasts and both rate us with 5 stars and give us a review so others can learn what it's all about. Right now, listeners of Newsworld can sign up for my 3 free weekly columns at gingrich360.com/newsletter. I'm Newt Gingrich. This is Newsworld. I'm Newt Gingrich. Please watch Journey to America, my new documentary on PBS about 9 remarkable individuals who strengthened our country through their pursuit of the American dream. From Albert Einstein to Hedy Lamarr to Zalmay Khalilzad, we explore how individual stories help shape our national identity. Watch Journey to America, premiering Tuesday, January 14th at 10 p.m. Eastern, 9 p.m. Central on PBS and the PBS app.